She had one coat. She gave it away to a stranger. That single, stubborn act of warmth would redraw a map of loyalties, debts, and broken promises across a city that kept its hearts either locked behind steel or bought with violence. The night the city turned white, the storm arrived like a verdict. Big, indiscriminate flakes sweeping alleys, piling on windshields, turning footprints into thin, temporary testimonies. Street lamps glowed through gelato-thick air. The river, black as a wound, swallowed reflections whole. On the far edge of a parking structure, a luxury car idled with its engine dying. A teenage girl in a designer jacket had been pushed out into the cold, her breath making a wordless sound. Isabella Moretti's eyelashes were frosted. Her fingers had stopped finding warmth. Someone had taken everything from her in a space of minutes. Dignity, control, the safe life her surname promised. She had been left where the city left the unwanted, on the margins of its glitter, under a sky that felt indifferent. A woman came down the stairwell with a gait learned from sleeping on benches and in church vestibules, from counting small kindnesses like a tax on the soul. Her name, for the moment, was only the crease of a palm and the smell of lavender that clung to her as if it were a talisman. She saw the girl on the cold concrete and did what was neither clever nor heroic, but pure and inevitable. She took off her only coat. The coat was navy, threadbare at the cuffs, but warm enough to hold a life for a little longer. Nora Hayes wrapped it around Isabella like a secret, tucked the girl's chin with an uncaring tenderness, and pressed her own shoulders against the wind. She had no authority, no badge, no plan. She had a sister who would wake without her coat, and a stack of unpaid promises to a city doctor who took payment only in urgent eyes, and the hope of doing the right thing. On impulse, and with the kind of purpose that comes from having held someone else's breath for too long, Nora handed warmth to a stranger, and walked back towards the shadows. By dawn, the BMW was back up a story, the penthouse lights cutting a jewel of command out of the gray. Vincent Moretti did not move like a man who panicked. Panic for him was a tool he returned to the drawer of a quiet man's mind. He learned of his daughter in bars of silence. A call, a clipped report from the driver, the smell of antiseptic delivered down the line, and then the thin, lethal crack in the air that announced someone had failed him. Vincent stood at the window of his office, hands behind his back, fingers interlaced in the way of someone who kept order like a habit, and watched snow smear the city like an old movie in slow burn. The penthouse hummed with people who knew how to wait until given permission to act. Marco stood across from him like a shadow made competent, lips pursed, waiting for the cue.
Men in tailored coats whose collars held the smell of good leather and older sins moved like chess pieces, a quiet hum of surveillance, of vehicles primed, of options arranged. There are decisions that split into two halves, one that satisfies instinct, the other that right-sizes consequence. Vincent chose both. He ordered retribution first, because some things in his world had to be made immediate to be meaningful. Brandon Ashford, the smooth, entitled predator whose last name belonged to a family with more money than conscience, received a visitation that would dissolve his arrogance into a series of small, terrifying truths. Vincent did not enjoy that work. He considered it work that kept his world from being anarchy. The punishment was swift, clinical, and designed to ensure that Brandon would feel exposed in every place he'd ever called safe. It was a message, carved in ways words could not reach. Vincent's hands were steady as he instructed. The silence around him, heavier than the night, registered satisfaction like a mechanical watch ticking. But the other half of Vincent's decision was not about vengeance. It was about roots. He had a child, Isabella, and when his world cracked even in the smallest way, his response did not stop at the infliction of pain on those who deserved it. He set his hum quietly toward another direction, find the woman who had given her coat. A navy sleeve found in the snow is a small thing. It is a thread that can be followed. Marco, who prided himself on picking up lost threads, found the prints, bare, stubborn, in the soft mud beneath the overhang, each step a small trumpet of survival. The city had swallowed them with snow in places, but the trail existed. That she had kept walking instead of fleeing made the trail warmer, in a way only desperate people leave, a proximity to urgency that smelled like a name you can almost remember. The trail ended at the basement of an abandoned textile mill, the kind of place where the city keeps its mistakes in concrete. Nora lay curled in the corner, the navy coat folded beside her like a relic. Hypothermia had taken her into a fog where the edges of her decisions softened, fingers swollen and white, injured from a life that did not accommodate winter. Her lips were blue at the edges. Dr. Vasquez would later point to this as textbook moderate hypothermia, and she clutched a scrap of paper with a scrawl of a name, Lily. The name was small and significant, the kind of thing that made men like Vincent harder for a moment, as they saw what need could look like when raw. Marco did not hesitate. Men like Marco were made of loyalties crimped in the fires of necessity. He called Dr. Vasquez, the physician who had a line to Vincent in a conscience tucked behind the clinical. The doctor came with a satchel and a manner that was both warm and precise. He found Nora and moved the way a surgeon does around the fragile. No melodrama, only the cool appraising of a life not yet spent.
Vincent came to the hospital in a suit that swallowed the room. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice had the soft authority of someone who had commanded armies in the language of transactions and threats. He could have left, sent money, a lawyer, something sterile and corporate to cover the edges. Instead, he made an offer that surprised even those who thought they could guess his choices. Vincent offered Nora an arrangement. He would cover Lily's surgery in full. He would arrange for immediate housing. He would give Nora a legal job as his assistant, 2 years, so she could protect the fragile stability she had built from obligation and sacrifice. The job would be legitimate, documented, with safeguards. It was not charity dressed as pity. It was a proposal that came with terms, with recognition that her life had value beyond the ledger of his business. Nora listened as if the sound of his voice were another shape of winter, sharp, indifferent, and then softer as if warmed from within. She had reasons not to trust men who moved like seas in suits. Her life had taught her that promises almost always had an expiration date and a price. She had learned to measure offers by their consequences. But when she thought of Lily, her sister's small chest rising and falling shallowly in a hospital bed, the way hunger had always approached their house as a second, unwanted resident, her resistance folded. You must understand Nora the way she saw herself, not as someone to be rescued, but as someone who owed a debt of love. She had made the coat calculation fast, warmth now for another life, a consequence she accepted because the future she imagined for Lily was a map she could not afford to redraw on the cheap. When Vincent spoke of 2 years, it was a term like a bridge, not forever, but long enough for surgery, for recovery, for something that could carry them across a river of debt into steadier land. She accepted. The city has a way of marking transactions with small rituals. Nora signed the papers in a tiny, cramped office that smelled faintly of cedar and cleaning solvent. The contract was clear: salary, housing, legal protections for her sister, medical funds dispensed through Dr. Vasquez, and a non-disclosure clause as standard as the light above the desk. Vincent's signature was a straight line. Marco watched the exchange the way a man watches an engine start. Necessary, efficient, no sentiment. Nora left the hospital with an escort and a small box of donated clothes, the navy coat given back to her in fold form later, ironed and smelling faintly of the penthouse's lemon soap. Lily's surgery happened under the steady hands of Dr. Vasquez, who had earned his stripes in this city by taking long cases and sometimes long odds. The operation was not miraculous. It was delicate. A valve patched, a rhythm steadied. Recovery was cautious. Nora slept in a chair by Lily's bed with strange new comforts, blankets that did not remember old winters, and a thermos of tea that tasted of money and care. She watched the monitors watch her sister, and found that hope could arrive wrapped in sterile paper. Moving into the Moretti orbit was to enter a world that explained itself through surface. In daylight, the company was a clean line of legal entities, charities, trustees, and shareholder meetings. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and the citrus of someone who paid to be trusted. At night, the building's heartbeat changed. A private elevator hummed down to places details could be kept. Men and women who moved in that second rhythm had codes and shadows. Nora learned both and kept them separate, like a practiced cook separates flavors, so the meal arrives balanced. Isabella, when she woke fully, did not remember much of the night that had made headlines, only the cold and a girl's small hand tucked into her jacket like a bridge. She was bewildered and ashamed, not by the city that had failed her, but by a private feeling that left her raw and small. Nora's presence, wrapped in the coat like a promise, became a shape she could relate to. The two met in a hospital corridor where voices fell away, and only the smallness between them mattered.
Isabella's apology was a breath. Nora's acceptance was not sentimental. She had seen shame swallow whole the people who could not afford its cost. She simply said, "You're all right." The 4 syllables of rescue that never demand ownership. The first week of Nora's new life threaded oddities together. Morning briefings that introduced her to schedules and names. Afternoons where she translated Vincent's curt memos into the softer truth of logistics. Evenings when she walked through a kitchen that smelled like bread she could not yet imagine baking. She learned to answer a phone in a voice that belonged to a place of order, to sign invoices, to hold the paper still while Marco brought coffee that tasted of smoke and control. She learned names, the janitor with the old radio, the housekeeper who whistled past the lilies, the chauffeur who offered quiet smiles and the occasional lifeline of gossip. Each small interaction was a lecture in the construction of a life that had seemed hermetic until that winter. Vincent watched her. He watched with grave eyes that gave away little and betrayed less. At first, he watched because she was a variable in a ledger. Later, watching her became its own kind of currency. He noticed the way she folded paper with a care that made pens jealous, the scar on her knuckle from a knife that cut bread in a small, inadequate kitchen. He found himself in the quiet way some men find music, accidental, then necessary. There were small rituals between them that no one would have called romance in the raw. A cup of tea left beside her laptop, an envelope of cash turned into a locksmith for a door that thudded open too often.
He offered no flattery. Vincent's gestures were workmanlike, ceremonial in a way that made them feel like promises carved into stone. Yet Nora kept her edges. She never became grateful in a way that invited subjugation. When Vincent's gifts arrived, she acknowledged them and then turned to plan. She made lists, she asked questions, she insisted on meetings with Dr. Vasquez to understand Lily's recovery schedule. She negotiated, not groveled. She demanded clarity in ways that surprised those who expected the poor to be grateful for a pittance. That posture earned her a different kind of respect from Vincent. It reminded him that whoever offered protection must be ready to meet dignity halfway. Isabella and Nora's relationship flickered like a candle learning favor in a draft. The girl asked uncomfortable questions that adults skirted. She wanted to know why the woman who saved her was sleeping in the guest room of their home. Nora told parts of the truth and left the rest unsaid. There was no attempt to rewrite the world, only a small reconfiguration of who sat at the table. The navy coat, for its part, moved through scenes like a totem. Once it had been the literal warmth that kept a life from freezing. Later it was folded beside Lily's bed. Then it became an object in a drawer in Nora's new apartment, a reminder of an action she had done before she had asked to be known. Vincent had it inspected, lined, reinforced at the seams, as if one could iron courage into fabric. He kept a copy of the coat's story in the files, the way one keeps an heirloom, somewhere between record and ritual. Outside the Moretti bubble, the city kept turning. Dr. Vasquez sent updates, dates for follow-up, a careful schedule to make sure Lily's heart would not act like a traitor again. Ray Hayes, Nora's stepfather, the man whose cruelty had once taught her to measure trust by the width of a raised hand, was a problem Vincent resolved with bureaucracy and the right sorts of legal pressure. Ray was moved away, his influence neutered in small civil procedures. His removal was quiet, legal, not cinematic. Restraining orders, community intervention, the removal with a name from a lease. Nora watched, and for the first time in a long while, felt the possibility of a life where the past did not sit across from her at every meal. But the underworld is not a thing of tidy borders. Power seeds other appetites. For all Vincent's control, there were eyes always ready to look for soft places to exploit. Some viewed Nora as a lever, an uninsured lever only if pushed in just the right place. Rivals outside Moretti Tower watched for openings. The Clove family, distant enough to be dangerous and close enough to be ominous, learned of a story that could be pressurized into currency. She was the kind of asset the underworld liked, someone close to a boss, with a history possible to weaponize. Men who measured risk in headlines and leverage began to think, in low murmurs, of what could be done. That thought became a photograph long before it became movement. A cheap camera on the wrong side of the street took a picture of Nora exiting a clinic with Lily in a sling, her face bare and unashamed, in a way that made exploiters salivate. The image circulated to people who kept tabs. They noted the navy coat folded over Nora's arm, the penthouse in the background like a bright tooth in the night, the way a city could be read like a map if one knew which streets to follow. Inside, life continued in a series of small clarities. Nora learned to make lists of emergency phone numbers, to memorize Dr. Vasquez's protocols, to write down the time of every medication for Lily. The job gave her structure. The house gave her roof. The choice to stay gave her agency. She was careful with the gratitude Vincent's gift had afforded her. She was grateful, yes, but she would not be defined by it. On an evening polished with a thin rain, Vincent called her to his office. It was the first time he asked her to stay past the end of a day without reason. He stood by the window with the city unbuttoned below, hands in a rhythm that might have been nervous. He had a box on his desk, a small, unassuming object that stood like a hinge. Inside was the navy coat, refolded. He had commissioned a frame, a simple shadow box lined with the same warm wood that furniture makers use for keepsakes. "For when you want to remember the night you decided to save someone," he said, voice flat but not unkind. There was no flourish, only that signature willingness to make things permanent. Nora said nothing for a moment. She thought of freezing concrete, of Lily's small hand on her sleeve, of everything that had brought them to this room. To her, the coat was not a relic of a single choice, but a chain of obligations she had accepted, because love for her was work. "Keep it," Vincent added, "or don't. I had it cleaned." "I thought, thank you," she said, the word modest. It did not feel enough. When she left the office, the framed coat wrapped in paper under her arm, she felt watched in a new way. Not by Marco, or by the housekeeper, or by the chauffeur, but by a sort of distant hunger that made the city crackle at its edges. She could not name it yet. It was a current she sensed underfoot, like the vibration before a train passes. The photograph needed no more than a name to become a problem. That name arrived a week later, a single envelope slipped under Nora's door with no return address. Inside were 3 things: a photograph of Lily and Nora leaving the clinic, a note typed in short, "Watch the girl," and a single coin that had been painted black at the edges like a mockery. No threat, not in words, not needed. The implication carried its own gravity. Someone had eyes on Nora and her sister.
Nora paused in the hall with the envelope in her hand and felt the chest tighten in the way anxiety makes the body small. She thought immediately of choices. She could go to the police, but part of her knew the way the city processed women like her. She could tell Vincent, who would, in a manner that was part tenderness and part steel, have the sender traced and taught a lesson. She could keep silent and let the tension simmer like a bruise. She folded the photograph back into its envelope and slid it into the drawer where she kept the framed coat's cleaning receipt. For the first time since she had given warmth away, Nora felt a cold that had nothing to do with weather. At the same moment, in a room on the other side of the city, someone with a name from a family that made maps of streets and deaths sat back in a chair and fired off a single message. They had a new bargaining chip. The Claw family's fingers had touched the edge of their scorebook, and where a woman slept uneasily in a cheap apartment, someone elsewhere was fine-tuning the machinery that turns information into leverage. When Nora told Vincent about the envelope that night, because she did not want to carry the weight alone, he listened the way an oracle listens when a village brings a broken tool to be fixed. His gray eyes turned slow and heavy. He canceled a dinner he had planned, shifted meetings. Marco already had men out, because Vincent had learned the city's grammar for escalation and had the patience to move like a man who had faced worse. "It's leverage," Vincent said, as if discussing a mechanical problem rather than the lives that spun on either side of it. "They test, they see what will move." Nora wanted to say that she didn't want his war. She had enough of wars. She wanted to say that she wanted Lily to be allowed to grow up like some other people did, ordinary, with the humdrum troubles only houses with doors and locks know. She said instead, "I'll call Dr. Vasquez. We'll change the schedule. Be careful." Vincent watched her pack a small bag. He watched the way she folded, the way she made a line of things that felt like preparation. For the first time, he realized that he possessed an immense capacity to do violence on behalf of the people he cared for, and a smaller capacity to keep them safe afterward. He summoned Marco and told him to broaden the sweep. He told the house to make sure Lily's routine vanished into shadows. He told Nora to sleep in the guest suite for the next week. She did. That night, Nora slept with the framed coat folded on the chair like a promise. Outside the penthouse, the city breathed 1,000 small anxieties into the storm drains. There were watchers, always watchers. She felt them like static at the base of a nerve. Her decision to accept Vincent's offer had been practical. Now it was also tactical. Protection had a cost. But the cost, as far as she could see, was less than what would happen if Lily could be ransomed by fear. Morning came soft and charged. Nora stepped into the guest suite and pressed her palm against the glass of the framed coat. She thought of how simple the original act had been. A sleeve over shoulders, another person's body tucked into warmth. It had been a kind of faith more than bravery. She had believed that keeping another alive might be the thing that kept her own heart beating. Below in the city, a car paused at a corner. Two men in plain coats watched a woman in a door overhead and made a note in a ledger. They did not know her name. They had a photograph. They had a file. They were careful. That sort of care is not benevolence. It is calculation. Nora had not come into Vincent's life to be a chess piece. She had come in to save a sister. The city had different plans, and already the next move was being arranged by people who saw leverage before they saw lives. She tightened her fingers around the framed coat and felt the echo of that first night. The winds, the smell of lavender, the smallness of the world narrowed into a single incandescent act of giving. She lifted the box and carried it into the bathroom, where the steam made the glass fog like a memory in reverse. She wiped a circle clear with her thumb and saw herself as she had been and as she had become, a woman who had traded the absolute clarity of one night's heroism for the slower, complicated weight of being saved and being responsible in return. Some doors open and the rooms inside are quieter than the step they require. Other doors open to alleys of consequence. Nora did not know, at that moment, which kind of door she had stepped through. She only knew that the city, which rewarded both brutality and kindness in strange portions, had begun to notice her in a way that felt dangerous. 2 days later, a delivery arrived at the Moretti offices, an unmarked courier leaving a ledger-sized envelope for Marco. Inside were surveillance photographs taken with a long lens. Nora at the clinic, Nora entering the grocery, Nora walking under a streetlight with the framed coat under her arm. On the back of one photo in black ink was a single stamped word, price. It was not a direct threat. It was a market analysis, the kind the underworld performs with clinical detachment. The ledger was a forecast. Vincent put the photos under the weight of his palm like a man weighing coin. He did not look surprised. Surprises had been accounted for in his life. But there was a change in the angle of his jaw that people who knew him read like a map. He understood leverage. He understood how appetite sharpened around soft targets. He also, in a way that made him dangerous to himself, understood the cost of letting something happen to someone he cared about. Keep Lily inside until we sort it. No clinics unless Dr. Vasquez insists. Increase surveillance.
Marco, find where those images came from, quietly. Marco nodded. His fingers moved to the ledger like they always did, sowing men and murmurs across the city. The engine of retaliation is not always about sudden violence. Sometimes it is about correcting a slide in a balance of power before it becomes a flood. Nora learned to move in ways that accommodated watchfulness. She started wearing 2 coats layered, the navy inside and a cheap, nondescript one outside when she had to leave. She practiced small routes. She changed doctors and then changed them back when the bureaucracy locked like a jaw. She lived in the liminal space between gratitude and fear, between payment received and consequence expected. At night, when the house quieted and Isabella drifted past with headphones and a homework assignment, Nora walked the penthouse's terrace. The city stretched like a map of both possibility and threat. She would look at the framed coat on her dresser and think of the girl she had warmed with it that night, Isabella, who had a father who punished quickly and loved fiercely, and wonder whether the gift she had given had done anything but trade one danger for another. The house hummed with a comfort that had been purchased in a way she had not imagined. Unknown to Nora, the seed of danger had already rooted in a place she could not yet see. A man in the Claw family had a ledger of debts and saw in Nora an opportunity to extract not just money, but control. He did not care whether the city called him villain or broker. For his family, leverage was a capital asset. And yet, before leverage turns into action, life continues in its small granularities. Lily laughing at a cartoon in a hospital bed, Isabella pressing her forehead against Nora's temple in a rare, intimate gesture between girls, Vincent standing at a distance like a man learning to hold tenderness without breaking it. The framed navy coat sat on Nora's shelf like a lighthouse, both beacon and target. She had done a thing that would ripple far beyond the night she acted, and already the ripples were bending toward unknown shores. In a basement somewhere else, men looked at the photograph and lit cigarettes.
feet up on crates, and decided to make a phone call that would change the nature of Nora's safety. The city, which hides dangers under snow and in bright facades, kept both its threats and its kindnesses in a steady ledger. For now, Nora lived within the credit side, but ledgers must balance. The weight on the other side was shifting. A week later, when the sky was still low with snow and the city hummed the same, Vincent called Nora into the office again. The light came through the high windows like a cut of glass. He handed her a letter, an envelope addressed in a hand she recognized, his. Inside was a single sheet.
He wrote that her position would be expanded in access and responsibility, that her wage would increase, that she was free to take time for herself and her sister whenever required. He also left a line that said, "If anyone touches what is yours, they will not leave unmarked." Nora did not answer with vows of thanks. She simply folded the paper and slid it into her pocket, the equivalent of a man carrying both a map and a weapon. She looked at Vincent, who held the space like a man who had built a city out of rules. There was something between them now, a mutual recognition that what began as an act of pure giving had become a pact that could hold or unravel depending on the decisions of men who prefer to use people for leverage. She left the room with the paper in her pocket, the framed coat in the next room, and a new awareness that she had stepped into a life that required vigilance. The city has ways to punish care. It also has ways to reward it. Nora had not sought to be the center of a ledger. She had sought to keep her sister alive. Yet in the concrete arithmetic of power, that desire was a demand that others would come to measure. When she returned to the guest suite that night, she found an envelope under her door. Her breath caught. Inside was a single photograph, taken from across the street, that showed a man standing in the rain across from the Moretti building, looking up as if counting windows. His coat was dark. He had a cap pulled low. There was nothing on him to identify him, except a glint in his eye that caught the flash. The coin Vince left as a token, an old thing wrapped in paint, was nothing compared to the currency of a photograph. Nora put the picture next to the framed coat and sat at the edge of the bed and realized what the city had taught her. Kindness could be tracked. A good deed could be held up for bidding. The ledger of people with power would always try to turn human warmth into currency. She turned off the light and lay awake. The penthouse hummed. In the dark, the coat's shadow on the wall looked like an outline of a person. She thought of Lily and of the narrowness of the choices that had guided them. She whispered a small private apology to the world she had left behind and a promise to the one she was building. In the corner of her drawer, the note Vincent had given her lay folded. It read like an offer and like a warning. Protection comes with cost, but not always the kind you expect. Outside, someone took a phone and dialed. It was a small action in a city of small actions that become storms. The man on the other end listened and smiled in a way that made a glass bottle tremble on a windowsill. The photograph of Nora, once diffuse, had a buyer, and where there is buying, someone will decide to sell action for profit. The storm that began with snow during the night had not yet finished. It waited, patient and white, as if to watch how people will trade warmth for safety, how the ones who give can become targets, how those who take control can sometimes become guardians. Snow muffles sound only until footsteps begin again. Footsteps were now gathering around Nora's life, and somewhere beyond the penthouse, the ledger made a note in ink that smelled faintly of rust. She closed her eyes and for the first time in months allowed herself to believe that perhaps, for this small corner of the city, generosity had bought a permanent shelter. The thought was foolish and tender, and the city indulged it for the moment. In the dark, she could not know whether she had stepped into a new family or into a different set of binds. She only knew she had treated warmth once, and the world had shifted to account for that trade. At dawn, a shadowed van rumbled away from a side street, the city swallowing the sound under the noise of commerce. On the dashboard lay a file with Nora's photograph, and beneath it, in a handwriting neither businesslike nor careful, someone had written, "Test successful. Proceed when ready." The phone call came like a snapped wire. It was midnight, and the penthouse slept in a linen of hush. Snow against the windows made the city seem farther away. Vincent had gone to his room early, an old instinct to be near the parameters of control, and Marco sat at his desk, pen idly tracing the margin of a report. The line that connected the two men was thin and private. It did not carry rumor, but fact. "She's been taken," Marco said. The words landed like a physical thing. For a second, the world inside Vincent's skull narrowed to the beat of a pulse. He stood slowly, as though recalibrating an instrument. Where? Warehouse off Dock 4. 2 men, possibly 3. They moved fast. Witness says a van with no plates. There was a thing that happened to Vincent at times like this.
The gray in his eyes contracted until it was all surface and light. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of logistics. Assemble a team, he said. Quiet. Bring keys to everything. He did not, in that hour, order men to tear the city apart for pleasure. He ordered them to find the place where someone else had calculated he could be forced to pay. That the calculation included Nora, someone who had offered him an unbidden kindness, tilted the ledger from business to personal. The men he gathered were not executioners on holiday. They were methodic, surveyors of rooms, readers of structural texts, practitioners of brutality with a code. They moved in a way the city recognized and gave grudging respect to, the kind of people who could find a cigarette lighter in the dark or a tapped line under plaster. Nora, for her part, did not give herself over to fear. She had been taken not from the penthouse, but in the street, a block away from a pharmacy where she had bought Lily's medication.
A van, a hand at her elbow, the smell of oil and something metallic, quick, professional. They had put a blindfold on her, manhandled her into a back room that smelled of rust. Then the blind came off, in a warehouse that held the memory of industry and nothing that was living. Her captors were not glamorous. They were men who rehearsed menace like craft. A light bulb dangled from a wire. The shadow it made them larger. They asked questions that smelled of negotiation. Who is your boss? What does he value? How much will he pay? They moved their voices over her like hands testing seams, seeing where she might burst. One of them, thin, precise, had the ledgers calm. He wanted to reduce taste to numbers. Nora answered in the ways she knew how, truth measured and partial. She gave no names that would endanger other lives. She refused to betray the privacy Vincent had afforded her. That refusal, in a room of men used to buying silence, was an irritant. Tell them you work for him, one said. Tell them where your sister is. We don't need to hurt her. We need to make the price higher. She smiled without mirth. You already know my sister's name. You already have my picture. You don't know what we can make him do, the thin man said. I know this, she replied. You can make men do things. You can't make everyone love what they do afterward. The words were small and brittle and did not sway the ledger. They only marked a boundary. For all Nora's courage, the men's plan unfolded with a slow, practiced amusement. Offers were typed, demands were sized, they took inventory of everything about her life that could be turned into weight. In the penthouse, Vincent received a photograph a few hours later. It was a crude shot taken from a distant rooftop, Nora blindfolded, hands tied, a thin light throwing her shadow across corrugated metal. Someone had added a note, printed in clinical, proof of possession, tags to identify where they were sleeping, a set time for negotiation. Vincent did not throttle the phone. He placed it on the desk and breathed, an apparatus drawing air for a long, measured moment. Find the dock 3 blocks north, he told Marco. Find the van route. I want blueprints, I want entry points, I don't want a broadcast. I want doors taken and not opened. Marco's response was a single nod, and he moved to the team the way a foreman moves to lift a beam. There would be planning. There would be routes traced on maps and men rehearsing a choreography of calculated violence. Vincent found himself thinking in this small currency of protection, how to ensure Nora's survival with the least expenditure of the things he valued, men's bodies and his own reputation. He also felt a different thing, an exposure in his chest he had not allowed himself to name. People estimated him in columns of threat and profit. They had not counted on a woman in a coat to open his ledger to tenderness.
That the tenderness now might be bloodied made the ledger nauseous. The team moved at dusk. Marco drove a route that took them past shuttered warehouses and dark rails. Vincent sat in the lead vehicle with a suppressed pistol that was part instrument, part icon. He had not expected himself to be on the transport. Instinct made him move like a man who wanted to be where risks were named. He had not expected the tightness in his hand when the vehicle idled outside a row of brick and iron. The warehouse they found had a front of cinder blocks, windows barred and full of grime. Inside, the smell was of oil and damp cardboard. The men who held Nora were confident, the sort of people who thought leverage was a good night's work. They had a plan for how to play him. They had assessed his penchant for action and intended to use it as negotiation currency. What came then was not the tidy violence of films, nor a parade of line-drawn heroics. It was a ragged, dangerous choreography, where fates were decided in the space of seconds. Vincent moved like a man who had taught himself to be precise. He gave one value: do what protects her. Marco's people flowed like a river finding a path. Doors breached, a scream muffled, the crack of bodies. The warehouse echoed with the coarse sounds of impact and the sharp smell of fear. When the first man saw Vincent, recognition made legitimate sentences of him. He had not expected the boss. People make the mistake of believing that threats work only from below. sometimes the real threat arrives unpromised at your door. The fight was fast and close. Vincent's hands were not unfamiliar with holding a weapon. He used a knife through a hand to disarm, a shoulder shove that made a man's jaw meet concrete. He was not elegant, he was efficient. One of the captors went for Nora with the intention of dragging her sideways. Vincent stepped between them and took a hit that would later become a line in doctor's notes. A bullet grazed his rib, shallow enough to make him breathe like a man learning an old wound, deep enough to demand a hospital. Nora, when she saw the blood, panicked in the way anyone does upon seeing a man who had always been cool, suddenly made fragile. She tried to unbind herself with the small, fierce competence of someone who had lived by tenacity. She shoved at ropes with fingers that had learned to be useful. When at last the rope came loose and she ran to Vincent's side, she saw him as a man who had just traded anonymity for risk. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow. The hand was warm and smelled faintly of lemon and smoke. She felt something in her body break and remake at the same time, gratitude braided with surge. The two of them sat in the crush of people and bruised wood, the world reduced to a pulse and the sound of men breathing. They got out in a flurry.
Marco and the team hauled away what needed hauling and left the 3 remaining captors watching the back of their heads as someone read them the elements of the lesson one remembers in prison. Vincent did not celebrate. He had never been one to savor the fall of his opponents. He only moved to Nora and collected her like something fragile he had not known he desired. At the hospital, Dr. Vasquez's face registered both the medical and domestic, concern for the wound, concern for the social strings attached to one. He cleaned the entry wound with the clinical cool that had saved lives before. The cuts were not catastrophic. They would take weeks to heal. The bullet, shallow, had been subcutaneous. It would not kill him. The truth was, Vincent had left richer if bruised, but the cost on his body was visible for the first time to people who had known him as something titanium. Nora sat at the chair by his bed while monitors watched the underside of a knight. She had not been injured, though adrenaline made her hands tremble. Her lavender scent, whatever talisman she kept, seemed surreal against the hospital's chlorine air. Isabella hovered, small and earnest, asking topsy-turvy questions that had nothing to do with ledger books and everything with wanting to be safe. Vincent watched Nora with a slowness that was almost tender. "You shouldn't have been alone," he said. The sentence was not an accusation, but a confession of the way he had been shaped by the possibility of her harm. "I wasn't alone," she answered. "I had a plan. It fell apart." "Plans can fall apart," he said. "I prefer them whole." There was a tight, raw honesty in that room. 2 people, each bearing lives that had been formed under different forces, had been brought back to a point of admission. Vincent's wound made his body lean in a way he rarely allowed. Nora, who had always measured love by its labor, felt something like debt and something like relief mingling into warmth. Later, in the hummed silence prefacing dawn, they confronted the thing that had always hovered between them and now demanded speech: gratitude for risk and consent. Vincent's voice was small and careful. "You could leave," he said. "You don't have to stay." Nora thought of Lily and of the 2-year bridge she had stepped onto the night she signed for surgery. She thought of the way the world makes generosity into purchase. "I don't see leaving as unmaking what I started," she said. "I see it as continuing." Vincent watched the way she clasped her own fingers as if to keep herself together. He listened to her reasons for staying, Lily's needs, the fact that she owed a small private loyalty to a girl who had been placed into her life by chance. Anything he said then would tip a balance. He reached not for a vow, but for clarity. "Then stay," he said simply. "But stay because you want to, not because you feel you must. No pressure beyond that." Her answer was a nod, a small permission that felt enormous. It was not a kiss, but the preface to one. The weeks that followed were a kind of shared convalescence. Vincent's wound healed under Dr. Vasquez's careful watch. Nora's nerves unwound like a spring let out slowly. The city, having been made to see that certain lines could not be crossed without consequence, backed off in increments. An anonymous call, the amount of open trade in messengers. The Claw family, who had learned a harsh lesson about who had things worth the blood that might buy them, recalibrated their markets. But consequences don't simply vanish. They tick and ferment. There were legal repercussions. Investigations were set in motion, not only because the Moretti name had power, but because the captors' ties to the underworld made them risky suspects for many. Vincent used legal channels as he used everything, as a complement to presence. He ensured the captors were charged. He ensured Ray Hayes, whose small cruelties had lingered like a stain on Nora's life, found himself in a legal labyrinth that ended with him being barred from contact and moved far from their city. Nora saw the man who had once taught her to be small removed the way a surgeon removes a tumor, precise, necessary, and not theatrical. At the hospital, after the immediate danger had passed, Vincent and Nora found themselves in a quieter, more dangerous trial, the slow growth of something between them that was not possession or rescue, but a partnership formed in shared danger. He learned what it meant to be careful with a woman whose spine had been forged by necessity. She learned what it meant to accept care without feeling bought. They moved with deliberate gentleness. There were small rituals, each mapped to the motifs that had already lived in their lives. He left a cup of tea by her laptop with a note. Nothing more than, for when you need warmth. She found his watch, left for repair, returned with a new band and a note, keep time. Isabella came to Nora with sketches she had made in a fit of gratitude and apology. Nora hung them on a bulletin board and found herself smiling more than she had in months. The fragility of what they built meant conversations threaded through with consent. Vincent learned to ask before he stepped into a room that was hers. Nora learned to speak plainly about fears that had been silent before. At night, when the city was a low mechanical hum, they would find a place on the terrace and let the gray eyes of Vincent rove over the map of lights and threats. The coat, framed on her dresser, stared back at them like a quiet witness. Two things matured in the intervening months. Lily's recovery and the heat of public pressure that had once turned space into purchase cooled into legal forms. Dr. Vasquez's slow follow-up visits grew less frequent. Lily's color returned. She gained weight. She laughed and choked on a piece of bread with the ungainly delight of a child who is learning to hold life in her hands. Nora sat in parent-teacher-style meetings and held the look of a woman who had fought for custody of the future and was learning what it meant to be allowed to have one. The Clove family did not disappear, but its appetites were checked. Deals were rearranged. Deals that touched Nora were allowed less leverage. Vincent's pressure had a cost, but it also insulated a life that now had the potential to expand beyond the immediate calculus of survival. The city adjusted as the ledger found a new balance. About a year and a half after the night of the coat, Vincent asked Nora to come to a small lunch in his office. There were papers to sign, trust documents for the fund he wanted to create in Lily's name, legal forms that would slowly transfer portions of the estate as part of a plan to support the community center he spoke of, sometimes like a promise not yet formed. He had learned in the scratch of ledger after ledger that people who had been given shelter would one day need to give it. He wanted to create a bridge that wasn't just for his conscience. Nora read the documents with the careful glance of someone who had had to read contracts before. He had learned to let her parse language. She had learned to sit with the fact that sometimes power could be oriented toward good. They signed the forms together, and Vincent, in the half-light, took 2 hands of the ledger and folded them like a book he wanted to open with care. When the 2-year mark on her contract approached, everyone in the house knew how taut that day would be. For Nora, the terms had been a bridge and not a cage. She had built a life. Lily had become root and reason. Isabella had become family in a way that neither blood nor title had prescribed. Vincent had learned to be vulnerable in ways that did not make him weaker, only more human. The 2-year day was not a release so much as a graduation. Vincent met Nora in the place where the night had first cracked their lives open, not literally the concrete where she had placed the coat around Isabella, but on the terrace that looked out across the river at the city that had shaped them. Snow did not return that day. It was an unfolding spring that smelled faintly of ash and lemon. The navy coat, which had been commissioned to be reframed and displayed, had found a place in the entry hall of the Moretti estate, folded in a glass case that made it both visible and respectful. People who came to the house would ask about it and be given a small, measured story. Vincent handed Nora a folder. Inside was paperwork that dissolved the remainder of her contract and cataloged her freedom. His signature was a straight line across the bottom. "There's no more obligation," he said. "Only, if you want to stay, that must be because you want it." She looked at the folder as if it were a thing both fragile and necessary. "I earned some of this with my own hands," she said. "I didn't want to be sold into gratitude." He smiled, a small tilt of gray meeting the softness she had come to know. "You earned it and more," he answered. "You gave someone a coat and changed my life." Her answer was not immediate. She felt for a moment like the woman who had handed warmth to a child in the cold, measured, conscious, and brave, because the choice was her own. "I want to stay," she said then, "but I want it to be a choice for us. No more bargains." He nodded. The silence between them was not the empty kind. It was suffused with the memory of 1,000 small things. Tea on a desk, the sound of Isabella's laugh, the ticking of his watch. Time then folded outward. The adoption paperwork for Lily ran its legal arc and sealed in months the quiet certainty of guardianship. Ray Hayes, who had once been a presence like a shadow in Nora's past, remained distant in the new order of things. Brandon Ashford's fate, ruined and marked, had long ago become a cautionary law that lived in the city's underside like a whispered lesson. The captors had been charged and prosecuted. The Claw family had learned its appetite could be checked by more than money. There were, as life always provides, small, unglamorous rewards. Lily gained weight. She learned to climb stairs without fear. Isabella and Nora sat on the sofa and compared the grammatical mistakes in a school essay. Vincent found that the tenderness he had feared was not a chain, but a collaboration in which both people kept their edges. The wedding did not arrive like a spectacle. It arrived like a small, decided gathering on a terrace edged with lights, where the city looked honest and a little vulnerable. Vincent wore a suit that softened the sharpness of his silhouette. Nora wore a simple dress, and the scarf that had once warmed someone else was turned into a band at her wrist, an homage, not a relic. Isabella read a passage that was blunt and honest, and full of the way young people love without archives. Marco stood near the back with a face that had grown softer with the passing of time. Dr. Vasquez beamed like a proud uncle. Vincent kissed Nora with a careful gentleness that made the world hush. It was a kiss that acknowledged danger and chose trust anyway. Years later, the coat hung in a place of honor, framed in a quiet gallery room at the head of the new Moretti Community Center, its fabric protected but visible to those who walked in. The center had been built where an old factory once made things no one wanted to remember. It educated, it housed programs for women coming out of shelters, it offered funding for medical needs and for apprenticeships. The ledger had grown new columns: care, education, restoration. People who had once been ledgers in a book now sat on benches and learned new trades. Children laughed in classrooms where snow once piled. The coat was there not as a testament to guilt, but as a reminder of one small human choice.
On the center's opening day, Vincent stood a little off to the side in his practical way, gray eyes quiet as a man who had learned to measure time beyond profit. Nora moved among people with a confidence that came from having been built and built again. Lily, who had once been a fragile patient, ran across the lawn with a childlike speed that made everyone laugh. Isabella, grown into a young woman who kept a ledger of her own, of kindnesses more than debts, walked beside her like a sister. A young boy pointed at the framed coat as they toured the gallery. "Why is that there?" he asked, blunt as a question always is. Nora knelt and took the boy's small hand. She smelled slightly of lavender as she explained, in words made simple for a child, how one small act of warmth could be the seed of many other things. "Because someone gave warmth to someone else," she said, "and because someone decided to turn that warmth into something that would keep other people warm too." Vincent, watching them, felt some old armor shift and fall away. He walked over, and in the soft light of the gallery, he took Nora's hand. He did not make a show. He did not make an oath to fix the world. He made a simpler offer, a ring, plain and honest, that suited a man who did not do theater. "Will you continue with me?" he asked quietly. "Not because you must, but because you want to." Her answer was to let the boy lead her hand, and then to slide her own onto the ring. She said yes, not as a surrender, but as a choosing. They sealed it in the way two people who had been tested seal things, with plain speech and steady hands. When the center opened fully, it carried Vincent's name on a small brass plaque, but it carried Nora's life in its programs. It carried Lily in its children's rooms, in the heart of the design. It carried the navy coat in a frame with a small placard that read simply, "For warmth, for life." People would come to the center and ask about the story, and be given a version that did not glamorize the violence that had marked its beginning. They were told of consequences and of legal routes, and of the ways communities must bind people together so the ledger remains full of grace as often as it is full of accounting. The center provided pro bono legal clinics and was careful to teach people that power could be used to protect without dictating lives. On quiet afternoons, the two of them would take Lily to the river and watch the small boats move like clock hands. Vincent liked to stand with his watch open, listen to ticks, and notice how small things shaped whole lives. Nora liked to sit and tie shoelaces and count breaths with her child. Isabella lived like someone who had been given back childhood and had reassembled it carefully for others. The navy coat stayed in the frame. Once, Nora asked Vincent if he ever regretted the things he had done to make protection quick and total. He looked at her with eyes that had been taught by the city to be steel, and now softened by time. "I regret the things that required it," he said, "but I do not regret meeting you. I do not regret learning what it is to care." "Then it's done," she said. "We made the ledger different." It was not a fairy tale. There were taxes and bills and neighbors who complained and old enemies who still plotted small things. But in the center, the ledger found an entry for restoration that meant something. They had been given something they had not asked for, power, and they had tried to use it to create breathing room for others. Years later, on an ordinary afternoon, a child at play tugged on the sleeve of a man who had come to volunteer. "Look," she said, pointing up at the framed coat. "This lady gave her coat away. She saved someone, and then they helped other people." The man smiled. He had his own ledger of choices. He nodded. "Yes," he said, "and that is how things change." Nora stood nearby, her hands folded, watching the small exchange like someone who had been given back a life to steward. Vincent moved to her side and draped his arm lightly across her shoulders, a gesture practiced and perfect, not possession, but partnership. The lavender she sometimes wore, the scent lingering like a memory, met the lemon and smoke in his presence, and the two scents made an odd, familiar balm. For a long time afterward, the coat hung in its frame, catching light, catching the eyes of people who wanted proof that one small act could outlive a winter. The city, which had always been keen to convert kindness into currency, now had a place where generosity was a currency for good. People came to learn, to sign up, to hold a small book and decide they would offer their time. On the night they framed the coat, when the house was nearly empty and Isabella had already gone to bed, Vincent and Nora stood alone in the entry hall. The coat looked smaller than it had on that first night, not because it had changed, but because the stories around it had grown larger. "Do you remember what it smelled like?" Nora asked softly, fingers tracing the glass. "Like lavender and smoke," Vincent said, "and like someone who didn't expect to be seen." She turned to him. The gray of his eyes had softened to a color that made warmth possible. "You were seen," she said. "You found me." He took her hand and held it steady. "You gave me a gift I didn't know I wanted," he said. "I gave you ones you needed. We spent a city to build a life." She laughed, quiet and bright as a coin. "We spent more than a city," she said. "We spent ourselves." Out past the windows, snow began to fall again, fine and almost confetti-like, settling on the glass with a soft, indifferent hush. It was not the storm that had started everything, but the motif returned, snow as a reminder that cold exists, and that warmth, when given, can change a map. Vincent and Nora stood in the hall and watched the flakes. They did not speak of the ledger that had once been tilted toward pain. They only stepped into the small future they had chosen, hands clasped, warm against a world that would always need people to give and people to receive. Share this story if you believe a small act of kindness can change a life.